Back in high school, I had a couple of close friends, Jason and Brian. We spent a lot of time together, and when graduation came, Jason had to move away to Lexington, South Carolina, with his family because of his father's job. After he had settled in, Jason invited Brian and me to visit him for a weekend. Out of boredom, we decided to explore the nearby forest and countryside, which had a scenic river running through it. The area was peaceful and beautiful, but we ended up getting lost. We couldn't tell which direction was upstream or downstream, and there were no signs of civilization anywhere. Concerned about finding a way back, we decided to keep following the river, hoping to come across a telephone to call Jason's parents. Eventually, we stumbled upon an old church-like building made of red brick, surrounded by overgrown bushes. It had a dirt parking lot with 4 old rusted cars from the 70s or 80s, all white or once white, parked in a row with flat or missing tires. As we got closer, we heard gospel music and singing from inside. Relieved that there were people there, we went in, hoping to use a phone. The moment we stepped through the doors, an old woman with white hair and horn-rimmed glasses, who had been playing the piano, stopped abruptly and looked at us with a blank expression. What happened next still haunts me. Everyone in the church stopped singing, put down their song sheets, and slowly turned to stare at us with vacant, unwelcoming eyes. Jason nervously said, "Sorry to interrupt. We just need to use your phone to call my folks." No one responded. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creaking of the wooden pews as the people sat motionless. Feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, we slowly backed out, closed the door behind us, and exchanged uneasy glances. As we walked away, Brian mentioned that there hadn't been a single cross or religious symbol inside. We turned to look back and saw a dozen men standing outside the church, watching us intently. Panic set in, and we took off running up the dirt road. After what felt like half an hour, we came across an old, broken-down gas station. The shelves inside were dusty and mostly empty. Behind the counter sat an old, overly tan man with a dirty baseball cap, reading a tattered book with yellowed pages. He looked up and said, "You boys lost, huh? Just head back the way you came, make a left, and follow the road till you see a telephone pole. Go right at the pole down the trail, and it'll take you to the highway." We thanked him and left quickly. As we walked, we glanced back to see the old man standing outside the gas station with his arms crossed, grinning at us with rotten teeth. We finally reached the telephone pole, turned onto the trail, and walked for another half hour. By the time we reached the highway, it was dark. We tried flagging down passing cars, but no one stopped. Thankfully, a police officer pulled over to help. After hearing our story, he whistled and said we had really gotten lost. It took him about 30 minutes to drive us back to Jason's house. During the ride, he casually warned us to be careful in those woods. There were some strange folks out there. That was the last time we ever went exploring in that area. This happened in Warren County, Georgia, a very rural inland part of the state. I was with my girlfriend Marissa, and we were driving around checking out the area to see if it was somewhere we'd like to live. It was very quiet and spacious, which is what we wanted. We're both Roman Catholic, though she likes to go to church a little more than I do. It was a weekday in the middle of the day, and there wasn't much traffic at all. We checked out a bunch of things in the area that would be important to see before deciding on moving there. Since Marissa has been an equestrian for most of her life, a big reason for moving to a rural area was so she could have a barn for her horses. After checking out some properties listed for sale, we happened to pass by a small, cute-looking church on the side of a very quiet road, with a bunch of cars in the parking lot. This church wasn't far from the last property we had just looked at, so Marissa shook my shoulder and suggested we see if a mass was going on to check it out. I pulled into the little dirt-like parking lot and parked next to an old red minivan. A lot of the cars in the lot were on the older side, most of them actually. I mentioned it to Marissa as we got out of the car, and she agreed, saying it was probably because it was a lower income area. I opened the door to the church for us, and we stepped inside. As expected, it was pretty small. There were 5 rows of pews on each side of the nave, or center aisle. At least 20 people were inside, but something felt off. None of them were elderly. Usually in any mass, big or small, you'd see a decent number of seniors, but from the backs of their heads, everyone seemed to be in their 30s to 40s. They were all sitting in silence as if in prayer. As we sat down in the back, the people closest to us started looking at us one by one. As others noticed the staring, they turned to see what the others were looking at, then stared at us too. Marissa and I glanced at each other, then nervously looked back at the people. All we could think to do was smile, but no one smiled back. They gave us the most unwelcoming stares. Then I realized none of these people were dressed remotely nicely for a mass. Something was definitely off. That's when it hit me. There were no women in the room, not a single one besides Marissa. And the way they were staring, it seemed like they were focused more on her than on me. A man wearing a mask stood at the front. By what I assumed was supposed to be the altar, he suddenly pointed at us and said, "Who invited you here?" I spoke up and explained that we were just passing by, saw a mass going on, and wanted to join. But this man was clearly not a priest, and this was clearly not a Roman Catholic church. The masked man responded, "You need to leave now." By this point, every single person in the room was looking at us. I quickly said, "Come on, honey," and we got up, hurrying out to the car. The moment we sat down, I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot right away. But as we looked in the rearview mirror, we saw someone from the building get into their van. At first, I didn't think they would actually follow us. But then, we saw the gray van catching up in the mirror. They weren't tailgating us, but they were close enough to make it obvious. Marissa quickly GPS'd the Warren County Sheriff's Office, and we drove straight there. The van followed us the whole way. The second we pulled into the public safety parking lot, the van kept driving down the road. Once it was gone, we drove straight home and never looked at Warren County again. We had clearly stumbled into some kind of cult meeting, but what I still don't understand is why they had someone follow us, why they were having their meeting in broad daylight, or why they didn't at least lock the door. A long time ago, about 8 years back, two friends and I, James and Sean, did something really stupid, but at the time, doing stupid things was just what we did to pass the time. We're not really friends with James anymore, but Sean and I still talk often, and this story comes up between us every now and then. We were 19 years old, living in New Jersey. Our town had a lot of vacant houses, and at the top of a hilly road not far from where we lived, there was an abandoned church. The locals knew about it, the road leading up to it was closed off, and it had been sitting empty for years. I don't know if it's still there since I live in Florida now, but back then James, Sean, and I, always looking for a thrill, came up with the genius idea to bring a Ouija board there one night. It was October, so I guess we were doing it in the spirit of spooky season. Sean had a Ouija board in his closet, so he brought it. I was the driver, so I picked up James first, then Sean, and we headed straight for the church. Since the road up the hill was blocked off, we had to park on the side and walk the rest of the way. We used one flashlight at first, trying not to attract attention, but once we reached the top of the hill, we all turned on our lights. The church was surrounded by woods and had a gravel parking lot beside it. It had been broken into countless times before, covered in graffiti, and the front door was already ajar. It scraped against the floor, so two of us had to work together to pull it open. Inside, we scanned the place with our flashlights, making sure we were alone. It was definitely creepy in there at night. Sean set up the Ouija board, then pulled 3 candles from his backpack, laughing as he said they would add to the experience. He placed them in a triangle around the board, and once they were lit, we turned off our flashlights. The only light now came from the candles, casting eerie shadows and making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet around us. We started playing with the Ouija board. Sean did most of the talking, opening with the typical, "Is anybody there?" kind of questions. The planchette began to move, and we laughed, assuming one of us was messing around. Whoever was moving it spelled out a few words, but before we could really react, we heard a loud cracking sound from the altar. It was like a thick piece of wood snapping in half. We all jumped and immediately shined our lights toward the altar, but there was no one there. We were all freaked out, but since the building was old and falling apart, weird noises didn't seem too far-fetched. We decided to keep going. We took turns asking questions, but the planchette had stopped moving. I think the cracking sound had shaken us up, making us take it more seriously. We sat there in silence for a while until another noise from the altar area broke it. But this time, before we could even shine our lights over, something landed on the Ouija board. We all jumped and screamed. It was a rock, about the size of a golf ball. A second ago, all 3 of us had our hands on the planchette. There was no way any of us had thrown it. Panic set in immediately. We bolted out of the church, leaving the Ouija board and candles behind, running full speed down the hill to my car. The whole time, it felt like we were being chased. We jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off. Back at James's house, we sat in the car for at least half an hour, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Sean, being religious and superstitious, was convinced we had reached a spirit. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but I did believe there had been someone else in that church with us, and that was just as terrifying. The next day, Sean and James went back to get the Ouija board, but when they reached the entrance, it was gone. The candles were still there, untouched, but the board had vanished. The moment they realized it was missing, they turned around and left immediately. To this day, this remains the single scariest experience of my life. When I was a Cub Scout, our meetings were always held at a Catholic elementary school, either in the gym or one of the adjacent rooms. I was about 8 years old when this happened, and it was deeply disturbing. Before I get into why I'm telling you this, let me start from the beginning. It all began a few days earlier when I was at Mass with my mom and my brother, like we did every other week. We were usually late, so we either sat in the back or stood by the doors if no seats were available. That day we sat in the very back corner. My mom and brother entered the pew first, and I sat on the end. At some point during Mass, I noticed an older man with glasses and a white mustache standing against the wall to my left, looking at me. When I glanced over, he smiled, making a stupid, creepy face, as if he was trying to be funny. But I wasn't a toddler. I was 8 years old. It felt weird and uncomfortable. I did my best to look away, but I could feel him glancing over at me every few seconds. When I looked back at him, he made another weird face, seemingly trying to be amusing, but it just came off as unsettling. My mom noticed this time. She tapped me on the shoulder and whispered to ignore him. I believe she also shot him a dirty look. The next time I looked in that direction, the man was gone. He had walked off somewhere else. The next thing I remember from that Mass was going up for communion. When I got back to my seat, the man was standing in that same spot again, staring at me, smiling the entire time until I sat down. My mom noticed once more, and since we had already received communion, we left. On the way out, she told me she didn't like the way that guy had been looking at us, specifically me. Now fast forward to when scouts come into play. Toward the end of our meetings, we sometimes had little fun contests or games. On this particular day, we were having a scavenger hunt. The items we had to find all related to scouting, things like a first aid kit, a rope, and a flashlight. We were split into 2 teams, each with a copy of the list. The team that found the most items would win, so we all spread out. The play area ranged from the gym to the cafeteria and some of the adjacent rooms. I was running through rooms and tiny hallways I had never seen before, searching for any of the items on the list, but I wasn't having much luck. Eventually, I ended up in a narrow hallway in the back section of the cafeteria near the kitchen. In that hallway was one of those ice cream freezers filled with popsicles. I looked inside to see if there was anything from the list. Nothing. But then, feeling sneaky, I decided to take an ice pop. As I did, I heard a man's voice to my right. I turned and saw the same man from church walking over to me, smiling. He said something like, "Don't let them see you taking that." Then he shut the freezer door and grabbed my hand, telling me he had better treats in the back, where kids weren't allowed. I broke free from his grip and tried to walk away, scared. But this time, he grabbed my wrist tightly. I turned to him and he went, "Shh, calm down." I yelled for help. He quickly let go of me and said, "Stop it." I ran straight back to the gym and told my Cub Master what had happened. Thankfully, my Cub Master was a genuinely kind and caring man, probably because he was a father himself. He immediately told my mom about it. When I explained to her that it was the same man from church, my Cub Master helped her report him to the church. It turned out that the man worked for the church. I'm not sure what his exact role was, but he lived on church grounds, which explained why he had been there. What makes me sick, though, is that allegations later surfaced from an altar boy's parents, claiming the man had touched him inappropriately. The thought of what he might have tried to do if I had actually followed him haunts me. I don't know if he ever went to prison, but I do know that the church cut ties with him after that.